So, once again, don't know what I'm getting myself into. American Psychos from EmpLemon. I saw one of his videos for Pandora's Box, and it's so far been my most viewed video. And as of recording this, it has gotten like 260 views. Technically, my first video was the most views, but immediately had to get taken down for copyright. So, yeah. American Psychos.
Brought to you by Manscaped. Stay tuned till the end for more information.
The morning of the day I got sick, I've been thinking, it's good to be in something from the ground floor. I came too late for that, I know. But lately I'm getting the feeling that I came in at the end. The best is over.
The events that most of the world calls the end of an era, Gorbachev's resignation, and the last lowering of the Soviet flag that flew over the Kremlin Dome.
I've been hearing a lot about the fall of the Soviet Union lately, and it's making me think that the Soviet Union's going to be making a comeback. I don't like that.
December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the last great American adversary was no more. After half a century of ideological warfare, they had lost and we had won. There were no more enemies left to conquer. The not-so-distant year of 2000 felt like turning a page into the future of civilization. A better world that would no longer have to struggle with the war, disease, and economic turmoil that had encumbered the 20th century. America, the last superpower standing, would lead the rest of the world into an era of peace and prosperity. Things were supposed to be different. We should have seen the warning signs, the sinking suspicion that something about the glorious American vision wasn't quite right. In hindsight, the slow and agonizing meltdown was staring this country right in the face. Most of us simply chose to look the other way. Aberrations to the system were written off as psychos, unfortunate lost souls who just didn't buy into the American way. I mean, after all, this place has everything you'd ever want or need.
I think I commented on the music in the last video I did of EmpLemon. EmpLemon?
How could anyone here possibly be unhappy? To find out, we have to take a look at two of the most miserable Americans ever put to fiction. The turn of the millennium saw two of the most influential creative works in recent memory, The Sopranos and American Psycho. Works which were inextricably defined by their unforgettable protagonists. Tony Soprano and Patrick Bateman are two distinct characters, conceived by separate writers, portrayed by separate actors, and broadcast on separate mediums. It's necessary to recognize that these two fictional men were independently created, because it makes their similarities all the more uncanny.
It's hard for me to pay attention to what he's saying, because of the music's just going so hard.
They premiered just 460 days apart. They live in and around the New York City area. Both characters can be described as an anti-hero. They each possess several very admirable traits which are drowned out by their overtly despicable actions. They are both somewhat obsessed with wealth and status. They're emotionally unstable, prone to outbursts of extreme fury. Neither can properly express their emotions to others, and struggle to relate to the world around them. Both are dissatisfied with their long-term romantic partner and have frequent affairs with countless mistresses. Both will listen to 80s rock music before brutally murdering someone. The long list of similarities between these two troubled characters may seem improbable, but it's no coincidence. They're just two sides of the same American story.
He discovered America is what he did. He was a brave Italian explorer, and in this house, Christopher Columbus is a hero.
There is something deeply wrong with the soul of this nation, and while many are quick to blame the hapless politicians of today, if you ask me, America's problems can be traced all the way back to the beginning, When Christopher Columbus first laid eyes on the native people of the American continent, he described them as the best people in the world. He was blown away by just how peaceful and harmonious their society was. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, the mysterious new visitors weren't exactly on a humanitarian mission. Just 100 years after Columbus first set foot on the American continent, 90% of the native population had been wiped out. An untold number of the best people in the world were enslaved and worked to death, scouring the lands for gold that never
Yeah, and everybody forgets about that.
even existed. From the very beginning, the history of the
Well, not when I'm president. Fables Raven. 2042, let's say. I don't even know if that's an election year.
United States
Or if we'd even have an election by then.
of America has just been one never-ending gold rush. No other country in history has had its identity so profoundly shaped by the insatiable lust for wealth. As Americans, the pursuit of fortune practically defines us. It is our centuries-long obsession, one that spawned out of a millennia-long insecurity. Since the dawn of agriculture, human civilization has been divided into two inexorable groups, the rich and the poor. For most of written history, poverty was generational and perpetual. The average person was born into bondage, either as a slave, a serf, or an indentured servant. They would spend their entire existence serving the desires of the wealthy, the only people within society who had any real autonomy. For thousands
Isn't that what we're kind of doing now, though?
of years, the barrier between the rich and poor was practically unbreakable. You were either on one side or the other, and would remain there for the rest of your life. But then along came the United States of America and a revolutionary new idea. What would happen if some of the poor
Yeah,
were
we forgot
allowed to
about
cross
that a long
over
time
to the
ago.
other side? In America, the thought of becoming wealthy is not just inspirational, but aspirational. It has been embedded into the very fabric of this nation through what we call the American dream. This ideal that anyone can rise through the ranks and join the rich and powerful. It's quite a compelling mantra, one that makes an even better sales pitch. And oh boy, did people buy into it. America became known far and wide as
I
the
like
land
this
of
guy.
opportunity.
This guy's got some
The
good
prospect
videos.
was so appealing that millions of immigrants would abandon everything they'd ever known and cross an ocean to get here. People often wonder what differentiates Americans from everyone else. To put it simply, this nation descended from a population of people who were willing to sacrifice just about anything for a chance at getting rich. And these days, it feels like that chance just keeps getting slimmer and
I like the Cowboy Bebop style music.
slimmer. While
I
there's
don't
been
know what
much
else to
debate
call
as
it.
to whether the American dream is still achievable, few have questioned whether the pursuit of wealth in and of itself is a bridge that's even worth crossing. Many would consider Tony Soprano to be a wealthy individual. He lives in a huge house on top of a hill with a pool, owns an SUV, a yacht, eats at fancy restaurants, pays for his kids to go to expensive private schools. He is living a lifestyle that most Americans can only imagine. But beneath the lavish excess lies a deeply troubled man, one constantly racked with guilt and regret over where all that wealth actually comes from. Americans are the consummate opportunists, and across the history of this nation, certain groups took it upon themselves to create their own opportunity. Tony Soprano is the de facto leader of the North Jersey Mafia, a collective not exactly renowned for their innocence. In the 20th century, American mobsters were as vilified as they were romanticized. They present us with an ethical gut check, testing whether our country's so-called virtues still hold up when taken to their absolute limit. It was the Italian philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli who once said the ends justify the means, a mentality that future Italian Americans would take to heart while running the country's largest criminal empire. In The Sopranos, Tony is one of its generals, with a battalion of soldiers at his disposal, and in the mob, the war is never ending. A lifetime of sin has delivered Tony a great deal of material wealth. The only problem is that he is unable to enjoy any of it. Tony is constantly tormented by a looming unease, a specter in the back of his mind that precludes him from ever resting on his laurels. Throughout the series, there is a prevailing theme of death and decay. The mafia is portrayed as this cancerous entity that gradually sucks the life out of everything it touches. It seems like the characters can't last more than a few episodes without winding up at another funeral. At each and every one, the survivors are left to wonder whether they'll be next. Over the course of the story, it's unsettling to see how Tony's friends and family are gradually whittled down to a fraction of what they once were. Of course, the mafia is not exactly the safest work environment, but at times it seems like the universe itself has it out for them. It's as if their very existence represents some sort of cosmic imbalance that fate itself must correct. The whole structure of the mafia could be described as imbalanced. Many of us may envision the gangster lifestyle as being surrounded by an egalitarian band of brothers, but The Sopranos portrays a far bleaker reality. Tony presides over a rigid hierarchy kept in place by a system of bullying and intimidation. It mirrors the experience which many immigrants endured when they first entered this country. It's been nearly 5,000 years since the ancient Egyptians built the first pyramids. Some would say that we haven't stopped since. You can get rich in America, but doing so requires making someone else even richer. Just like in the mafia, the money in this country only flows one way, and that's straight to the top. Look no further than the most profitable schemes that we put into practice. Casinos, the stock market, Powerball, religious and political fundraising, all exist simply as instruments to transfer wealth further up the pyramid by selling people the slim chance of one day getting there themselves. But for as long as America's been in business, the fastest way to get to the top of the pyramid has always been to create your own. It's no wonder why so many poor and immigrant groups in this country have often turned to organized crime. There's a good chance you'll end up dead on the street, but at least you got ever so closer to the top. As tempting as it is, however, only one person can reign as king of the mountain and collect the lion's share of the wealth.
I'm getting lost in I'm getting lost in this guy talking. He talks real nice.
While Tony lounges in his mansion, the rest of his subordinates live far more humbly, patiently waiting for a day when that may change. Tony may have positioned himself as the apex predator, but most of the time he ends up feeling like prey. He is relentlessly hunted by enemies, rivals, and federal agents. He suffers constant paranoia that one of his crew members will double-cross him. While money and status are promised to liberate us, Tony is paradoxically trapped beneath the weight of his prosperity. It turns out that standing atop the pyramid makes you a pretty big target, and leaves you with not much room to run. Tony is forced to tread a very fine line, where one wrong move can result in dire consequences. At times, his position of power seems far more like a burden than a blessing. Tony's obligations as a made man end up deteriorating pretty much every other aspect of his life. His health, marriage, and friendships are all compromised because business always takes precedence. And in the mob, there's always more work to be done. Americans have always had a complex relationship with work. No matter how cruel and
Work sucks.
degrading, backbreaking labor tends to be seen as virtuous, patriotic even. It should be no surprise why these ideals are so commonly reinforced. The whole system depends on it. In order for so many of us to bask in such excess, somebody's got to pick up the slack. Tony mentions numerous times throughout the show that he aspires to be like Hollywood actor Gary Cooper.
Whatever happened to Gary Cooper? The strong, silent type.
It's a sentiment echoed by generations of working-class people in this country who insist on passively grinding away through the unchanging system. We are taught to suffer in silence because there's always someone else just a little less fortunate.
See that church? Your great-grandfather helped build that almost 80 years ago. He was a stonemason, the old man. Came over from Avelina with $4 in his pocket.
In many ways, Tony
I haven't finished The Sopranos. I've only seen the first season. Should probably finish it. I know how it ends, though, so it's kind of hard to sit through it.
Tony's destiny is no different than his immigrant forefathers. He is condemned to work himself to death, generating wealth that he'll never truly reap. It's been said that money often costs too much, and for Tony Soprano, the pursuit of wealth has left him bankrupt just about everywhere else. The thing they don't tell you about the top of the pyramid is just how lonely it is when you get there. Tony's menacing stature has profoundly alienated him from everyone else in his life. His family distrusts him, and his associates fear him. The few people who actually get close to him don't tend to stick around for very long. Tony may have the responsibilities of a general, but deep down, he has always been an army of one.
Do you feel depressed?
At the very beginning of the series, Tony tells his therapist about a rare moment of joy, where he encounters a family of ducks in his pool. For him, they represent everything he can't have: innocence, bliss, and the ability to just fly away from all their problems. Then, just as quickly as they came, they left. And
Saw that part.
Tony is overcome by a deep sadness that he can't really explain. He holds on to a sliver of hope that one day they might return, but they never do. Tony, like most Americans, spends the rest of his life searching in vain for something he lost long ago. As it turns out, not everyone has to climb to the top of the pyramid. Some people are just born there. You could describe Patrick Bateman as the American endgame, the final destination of the American dream. He has everything anyone could want: money, power, good looks. He towers above the pitiful working class. As a matter of fact, we hardly see him doing any work at all. In terms of what we value in this country, he's hit the jackpot. For the average Joe, his position of providence is to die for, or from Bateman's perspective, to kill for. Because beneath the flawless exterior lies a beast so hideous, it makes us question what it even means to be human. Much like the royalty of medieval times, Patrick Bateman is a product of generational wealth.
I also haven't seen that movie. I probably should watch it.
He's never known anything other than a life of luxury, an ascendant trajectory laid out before him like a red carpet. From childhood estates to prep schools to Harvard to Wall Street, at every stage of life he has occupied the highest echelon of society. America's value system tells us that Bateman should be on Pleasure Island, when in actuality, he's a castaway. When you have everything, you start to have a hard time feeling anything. In 2013, 16-year-old Ethan Couch was driving drunk along a Texas highway when he struck and killed 4 people. Couch belonged to an exceptionally wealthy family and would disturbingly show little to no remorse for the casualties he just inflicted. For the victims and their loved ones, it was the most traumatic moment of their lives. But for Ethan, it was just another Saturday. The legal system seemed just as flippant about the tragedy, sentencing Ethan to a mere 10 years probation. Even more outrageous than the lenient punishment was the legal argument that Ethan's dream team of expensive lawyers had made in his defense.
The Green Simpsons are back.
The attorneys made the case that their client was suffering from affluenza, a medically meaningless term that was pretty much pulled out of thin air to absolve Ethan of any wrongdoing. They argued that Ethan's immense wealth had made him incapable of comprehending the consequences of his actions. Do the
I remember hearing about that story.
rich and powerful play by the same rules as the rest of us? For a country so quick to extol the value of equality, we desperately like to believe that's the case. However, the longer you live here, the more you start to realize that the wealthy are allowed to get away with just about anything. It's been said that money can't fix all your problems, but it can fix damn near most of them. Any trouble with the law can typically be smoothed over with enough attorneys at your disposal. And hell, if the price is right, you can even change the laws themselves in your favor. With the amount of influence they wield, Some wealthy are free to commit atrocities beyond our worst nightmares, and they tend to get away with it, just as long as they're not affecting anyone else even higher up the pyramid. The truth is that blind justice really only applies to the invisible masses. For the illustrious wealthy, America prefers to be blind towards injustice. Perhaps that's just yet another incentive for people to get there. It's safe to say that Patrick Bateman lives a consequence-free life. When it comes to vice, he does it all.
Damn.
Murder, necrophilia, cannibalism, the works. And throughout all the horror, he gets no closer to being punished for any of it. By the end of the film, he's practically begging to be held accountable for his crimes, but reaches the startling conclusion that the world around him refuses to do so. Bateman is portrayed as an unreliable narrator, so there's some debate as to whether he even committed those crimes at all. But regardless, the overall point remains the same. If everything you do is inconsequential, does that also make it meaningless? Such is the crux of Patrick Bateman's nihilistic existence.
You're inhuman.
No, I'm in touch with humanity.
Bateman and other members of the super rich are so far removed from working class people that they might as well be from a different planet. Forget empathy and remorse. Bateman seems unable to experience any emotion besides impetuous rage. Seeing him interact with others is like watching an alien attempt to mimic human behavior. There is something truly uncanny about the culture of the wealthy. Prosperity is supposed to grant us the freedom of choice, but you never know that from observing Patrick Bateman and his yuppie acquaintances. In a world without struggle, the battle for superiority has shifted to the realm of minutia. While trying to eke out the slightest edge over each other, they have been utterly consumed by their own vanity. It's beyond superficial, it's hyperficial, to the extent where nothing else matters besides whatever exterior facade each man puts on. Their entire being boils down to nothing more than a product of wretched materialism.
Because I want to fit in.
It is through this matter which the film presents a paradox. While each of these characters represents the epitome of self-interested individualism, that very mindset has forced them into the ultimate culture of conformity. Their so-called personal tastes have converged into a singularity, rendering each man completely interchangeable.
Don't you know who I am? I'm not Davis. I'm Patrick Bateman.
It is this contradiction which fuels Patrick Bateman's hysteria. His burning desire to be noticed has only made him as invisible as his victims. What are the consequences of living consequence-free? A world without punishment is a world without virtue. Wealth has historically been seen as the pathway to civility. It's a conception that has been used throughout history to justify the eradication of people and cultures from across the planet. It doesn't matter how despicably we act, as long as we deliver them from savagery. American Psycho subverts this centuries-long belief. For Patrick Bateman, wealth has broken whatever barriers were standing in the way of savagery. He may spend his days in a luxury Manhattan apartment, but he might as well exist on the plains of the Serengeti. After thousands of years of progress and evolution, the apex of humanity is no less barbaric than the primal beasts from which we spawned. Is there anything that actually matters in Patrick Bateman's wicked world? Well, maybe one thing: Dorsia.
What about Dorsia?
A restaurant so exclusive that not even Bateman's many gifts can land him a reservation. It serves as the single defiant obstruction to everything he represents. No matter how much he has, there's always someone else just a little more fortunate.
We should have gone to Dorsia. I could have gotten us a table.
Americans, more so than any other group of people, tend to equate wealth with virtue. The richest of the rich often top our lists of the most respected figures. The American dream relies on maintaining the belief that these incomprehensibly huge fortunes are fully deserved. And who knows, maybe for some of them, it is. But the vast majority of the super rich are a lot closer to Patrick Bateman than the alternative, wandering through some form of existence that's as hollow as it is amoral. In this way, Bateman is the true incarnate of the American dream. There is an idea of the self-made man, some kind of abstraction. But when you peel away the suit and tie, there is simply
I don't
nothing
like that.
there.
I didn't like that. I didn't like that. No, I didn't like that.
Both American Psycho and The Sopranos have this uncanny attribute of being almost perpetually contemporary. They're not exactly timeless, and the themes within are far from universal. Both works were designed to reflect the concerns and attitudes of the specific period in which they were released. In all likelihood, they were expected to be seen by future generations as products of their time. So if that was the case, why did they feel so much like products of our time? If you look back at every movie and TV show released around the turn of the millennium, you'd be hard-pressed to find any that have remained as culturally relevant as The Sopranos and American Psycho. There's even an argument to be made that these pieces of media are more popular today than when they first aired. There are many interpretations for why that's the case, but in my humble opinion, we find them so compelling because as time marches on, they feel less and less like fiction. It seems that whatever they were warning us about is coming more and more true with each passing day.
Think on the History Channel the other night on the American Revolution. You know we're the only country in the world where the pursuit of happiness is guaranteed in writing? Where's my happiness then?
It's the pursuit that's guaranteed.
But for as prophetic as these two works may appear, they aren't exactly unprecedented. We've seen this story before, and we know how it ends. To find out what lies ahead of us in the Roaring '20s,
You fall off a cliff. That's where it ends.
all we have to do is take a look back to a writer by the name of F. Scott Fitzgerald.
I've heard of him.
You could say he had America in his very blood. He was named after his most famous relative, Francis Scott Key, the writer of America's national anthem. For Fitzgerald, the story of America was practically inseparable from his identity, and it would soon become part of his destiny. It all started when he met his first love, a wealthy debutante named Ginevra King. Although they shared a deep affection, this American love story would meet a bitter and unromantic end. Fitzgerald's courtship would be rejected by Ginevra's family, who deemed him too poor to be worthy of their daughter's hand. The young writer was devastated, but the heartbreak would ultimately turn him into the literary master he was meant to become. In 1919, Fitzgerald moved to New
That's about how it goes.
York City, where he desperately tried to sell his work. At times, his situation was so bleak that he seriously contemplated ending it all. But when the year
that's
turned
about how
over
it
to
goes.
1920, he finally caught a break. A publisher had agreed to distribute his debut novel, This Side of Paradise, which would quickly become a bestseller. All of a sudden, Fitzgerald found himself in what he thought was his own version of paradise. He'd struck it rich, in what was arguably the best time in history to be rich. The US was in the midst of the Jazz Age, a period characterized by unparalleled extravagance and hedonism among high society. In an era of so-called prohibition, the wealthy would unleash never-before-seen levels of drunkenness, indulgence, and lust. For the first time in his life, Fitzgerald was invited to the party. He found a new sweetheart, a Southern belle named Zelda, who finally agreed to marry him after his financial success. He moved into an enormous mansion on Long Island, surrounding himself with opulence that rivaled kings of old. At last, he had finally infiltrated the coveted sphere which had eluded him for so long, but it didn't take long for him to realize that it was no paradise. After becoming truly immersed in the lifestyle of the rich and famous, Fitzgerald was overcome by a profound disappointment. His admiration of the wealthy quickly turned to repulsion. He found that no matter how many lavish parties he attended, he simply didn't fit in with his affluent peers. Deep down, he still harbored the smoldering hatred of a peasant, which he could never truly overcome. It was a soul-crushing epiphany, one that armed him with the wisdom he needed to start writing his magnum opus. Then in 25, Fitzgerald
So what, he didn't like poor people, so he wrote about psychos? Is that what happened?
released this, The Great Gatsby, his most acclaimed novel. A book so overassigned, most high school
That's
students
how I
probably
know
don't
him.
pay attention to the
Okay.
themes. But they should pay attention, because it's not just a critique of America's class system and the futility of desire. It's also a personal statement about the author's own struggle for fulfillment in an increasingly materialistic society.
There's a psychological condition known as alexithymia, common in certain personalities. The individual craves almost ceaseless action, which enables them to avoid acknowledging the abhorrent things they do.
We spend a lot of time imagining how life could be if we were filthy rich. But what if you actually were? What would happen if you somehow successfully crossed over to the other side?
I'd probably try and go to Mars.
Well, the character of Jay Gatsby did just that, and was not necessarily better off because of it. At its core, The Great Gatsby seeks to ask one very simple question. What does wealth actually give us? At face value, it seems obvious. Anything
Power to change the world for a lot of people.
we could ever want.
Some of them the
But
power
beware,
to go
you'd
to
be
hell.
surprised just how quickly that list of wants runs out. Sure, you could pay off your debts, travel the world, and buy the fanciest house, car, and clothing, but then what? In consumer society, money is everything. We are taught to view it as this universal cure to whatever ailment we may be suffering. Most Americans spend their whole lives believing this, because they will never have enough wealth to disprove it. As it turns out, no matter how much you have, there are certain things that money can't buy. Jay Gatsby has been described as having more money than God. His fortune is so exorbitant that he never wears the same shirt twice. Gatsby's wealth is practically unlimited, but it's still not quite enough to satisfy his ultimate desire. Across the bay from his estate lies a green light, attached to the dock of Daisy Faye. For a man whose money has bought him nearly everything else, she is his final frontier. He is not as much in love with her as he is with the concept of wealth itself.
Her voice is full of money.
But alas, in a story that mirrored the author's very own heartbreak, this romance was never meant to be. Despite his immense wealth, Gatsby had run into the very same barrier that we thought we vanquished long ago. The Great Gatsby highlights a new distinction which had been sparsely considered at that point in American society: the line between new money and old money. Even though he lives in one of the same enormous
That's a lot of
mansions
boats.
overlooking the same Long Island Bay, the culture of high society still sees Gatsby as an imposter. He may have more money than God, but he didn't always. Much like Tony Soprano, Gatsby is descended from immigrants. While it's not explicitly stated how he amassed his fortune, it is heavily implied that it comes from organized crime, which notoriously originated during the Prohibition era. However, wealthy society is no stranger to exploitation. It's not the source of Gatsby's money that's the problem, more so that he wasn't outright born with it. Gatsby is new money. He was poor at one point in his life. This immutable characteristic has branded him as an outsider to the rest of the super rich. They'll attend his parties, but they'll never truly accept him as one of their own. It's the defining attribute separating Gatsby from the story's antagonist, Tom Buchanan, the one man standing between he and Daisy. Much like Patrick Bateman, Tom inherited his life of luxury. He is abrasive, foul-tempered, and a generally detestable individual. By all measures, Gatsby would make a far better husband for Daisy, but therein lies the tragedy of the novel. In the realm of the rich and powerful, the quality of Gatsby's character has been rendered irrelevant. America's class divide is ultimately too much for romance to overcome. Daisy, like Tom, is old money, and at the end of the day, that's the only thing that matters. Regardless of how far he came, Gatsby never even stood a chance. But even though his dream was doomed from the beginning, he never stopped believing it. He kept on pursuing his fairy tale, convincing himself that everything he wanted was just beyond the horizon. He hadn't realized that the party was over. In the months after publication, The Great Gatsby would go on to be a commercial failure. F. Scott Fitzgerald suspected
About how
that
it
most
goes.
readers and critics didn't even understand what the book was about. In a correspondence with his editor in April of 1925, Fitzgerald could see the writing on the wall. He eerily signs off on his letter with the words, "Yours in Great Depression."
What happens when these antisocial personalities aren't distracted from the horrible shit they do?
They have time to think about their behavior, how what they do affects other people, about feelings of emptiness and self-loathing haunting them since childhood. And they crash.
4 years later, America's age of indulgence was brought to a screeching halt by the worst economic collapse in our nation's history. All across the land, the unsuspecting poor were punished for the sins of the wealthy. As the United States spiraled further and further downward, so too did Fitzgerald. His once whimsical relationship with Zelda had turned rotten, following a 1929 incident in which he tried to force their vehicle off a cliff. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and institutionalized.
That's not good either.
Fitzgerald continued to work on his next novel, but his persistent alcoholism and lack of motivation delayed the project until long after he was out of the spotlight. In an era of extreme poverty and destitution, America was no longer interested in reading about the excess of the Jazz Age, and Fitzgerald's works began to slip into obscurity. By the mid-30s, he was earning less than $100 per year off all his books, and had to once again settle for being a nobody. Fitzgerald came to view himself as a failure, spending the rest of his life drinking away the pain. The excessive alcohol began to take a severe toll on his health, and in 1940, he dropped dead of a heart attack at the age of 44. In an affair that paralleled the end of The Great Gatsby, hardly anyone attended his funeral. It was just a few years later when The Great Gatsby was selected as one of the works distributed to American soldiers serving abroad in World War II. Its newfound popularity sparked a critical reassessment of Fitzgerald's career. In the following decades, his 1925 entry would go on to be appreciated as a masterpiece. Today, it stands as one of the most agreed-upon candidates for the title of Great American Novel. The struggle between new and old money has stuck around as an enduring archetype in fiction. Its legacy has been carried on by modern-day characters like Tony Soprano and Patrick Bateman. It may not be possible to concisely explain what exactly is wrong with America, but whatever it may be, these guys surely embody it. There's something to be said about how these three unique characters from vastly different backgrounds are all chasing the same thing. Dorsia, the Ducks, the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. They each represent the supreme American fantasy.
Of being a psycho?
In this country, we want the unobtainable. Before the United States, the world was run on bondage. Until somewhere along the way we figured out that you can make people work just a little bit harder by convincing them that the freedom they desire is sitting just out of reach. Is it really a fantasy we follow, or a delusion? To be fair, you tend to be a bit delusional when you've gone psycho. Whether or not you want to believe it, the party's over for America. We are experiencing the downfall of a once extravagant empire. Perhaps all this time we weren't chasing a dream, but running from destiny. Regardless, the reality of our situation won't matter. It never has, really. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further. We beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
It was good. I liked it. I liked it a lot. I'll give it a 9 out of 10. What else you gotta say?
I live in a dilapidated shack on a mosquito-infested swamp between two pit bull breeders. My name is EmpLemon. I'm 24 years old. I believe in taking care of myself, especially below the belt. In the morning, I open up my Manscaped Performance Package 4.0 and start charging the Lawnmower 4.0 body trimmer while I do my crunches. I can do a dozen now. Once it's fully charged, I take the Lawnmower 4.0 into the shower and manicure my pubic region for 90 minutes until I exhaust the power supply. I then apply the Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant to trap and eliminate any foul stench being exuded by my scrotum. I immediately follow that with the Crop Reviver Ball Toner Spray, which contains aloe vera, so as to not dry your skin out and make you look older. I finish the rest of my routine with the Weed Whacker Wireless Nose and Ear Trimmer with built-in skin-safe technology to reduce the chances of nicks and cuts. There is an idea of the perfect YouTube ad, some kind of abstraction,
I heard you're not
but there
supposed
is
to
no
comb
real
your hair
pitch,
while it's wet.
only theatrics. And although I can hide my hatred of marketing and you can see me with the products I'm being paid to sell, and maybe you can sense that I can lead you towards a pretty good deal, it is simply not here. It's down there, in the description. Visit manscaped.com and use code EmpLemon at checkout for 20% off, free shipping, and
Wonder
2
if that
free
still
gifts,
works.
so you can get back to cleaning up whatever other messes life may throw at you.
Alright. Well, what do you think about that? I think it was pretty good. I like this guy's videos. I'll probably check them out another time.